What if, starting tomorrow, every adult in your country received a guaranteed paycheck from the government? No application, no income requirements, no strings attached, not unemployment benefits, not stimulus checks, not welfare, a direct cash payment, every single month, for life. It sounds radical. Some call it economic freedom. Others call it reckless socialism. Tech leaders argue it's the only solution to mass automation. Critics warn it could bankrupt entire nations. Supporters say it could end poverty. Opponents say it could destroy the work ethic that built modern economies. This idea is called universal basic income, and it may become one of the most important economic decisions of the 21st century. In this video, we're breaking down everything. Where UBI came from, why serious economists and politicians are debating it right now, the real-world experiments that have already happened, the math behind how it would be funded, the potential risks, the hidden trade-offs, and what it could mean for your job, your taxes, and your future. This isn't a surface-level explanation. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what universal basic income is, but why it's being taken seriously by governments around the world. The question isn't whether UBI is controversial. The question is whether the future of work will force us to choose it. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. The idea of universal basic income did not begin in Silicon Valley, nor was it invented by modern politicians searching for a new economic slogan. Its roots stretch back centuries into philosophical debates about property, labor, and human dignity. At its core, UBI asks a fundamental question. If a nation generates wealth collectively, through land, industry, technology, and social cooperation, should every citizen receive a guaranteed share of that wealth simply for being a member of that society? One of the earliest recorded proposals resembling UBI came from Thomas Paine in 1797. In his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, Paine argued that private land ownership deprived others of their natural inheritance. To compensate for this loss, he proposed a national fund that would provide every adult citizen with a lump sum payment and ongoing support in old age. This was not charity. Paine framed it as a right, compensation for access to the Earth's resources that had been enclosed and privatized. His idea established a moral foundation that would echo through centuries of economic thought. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, variations of guaranteed income concepts appeared in both socialist and liberal traditions. Some thinkers believed industrialization would eventually eliminate the need for most labor, making wage-based survival obsolete. Others worried about poverty cycles that markets alone could not solve. In the 1960s and 1970s, the idea resurfaced prominently in the United States under the term negative income tax, supported by economists like Milton Friedman. Friedman, a free market advocate, argued that a streamlined cash transfer could replace complex welfare bureaucracies and provide a minimum income floor while preserving incentives to work. At the same time, civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for guaranteed income as a direct solution to poverty. In his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? King argued that poverty persisted not because of individual moral failure, but because of structural inequality. A guaranteed income, he believed, would address economic injustice more effectively than fragmented social programs. The modern resurgence of UBI is closely tied to technological change. Automation, artificial intelligence, and globalization have reshaped labor markets. Manufacturing jobs have declined in many advanced economies. Gig work has replaced stable employment for millions. Wages in some sectors have stagnated even as productivity and corporate profits rise. These trends have revived fears that traditional employment may no longer provide consistent economic security. In recent years, UBI has been tested in pilot programs around the world. Finland conducted a 2-year experiment providing unemployed citizens with unconditional monthly payments. The results showed improvements in well-being and mental health, though employment effects were modest. In Kenya, long-term cash transfer experiments conducted by the nonprofit Give Directly have shown measurable improvements in financial stability and local economic activity. In the United States, small-scale city programs in places like Stockton, California provided residents with guaranteed monthly payments and reported improvements in employment stability and reduced income volatility. What makes UBI unique is its simplicity. It is unconditional. It is universal or near universal. It is cash-based. Unlike traditional welfare systems that require proof of poverty, disability, or unemployment, UBI eliminates eligibility complexity. There are no forms to justify need, no restrictions on how money is spent, and no penalties for earning additional income. This structural simplicity is central to its appeal. However, simplicity does not mean consensus. Critics argue that the cost of implementing a true universal basic income at a meaningful level would be extraordinarily high. Others worry about inflation, reduced work incentives, or political backlash against perceived free money. Supporters counter that current welfare systems are already expensive and inefficient, and that direct cash may actually reduce long-term costs related to healthcare, homelessness, and crime. The historical evolution of UBI shows that it is not a fringe idea. It has been supported at various times by conservatives, liberals, libertarians, and socialists, each for different reasons. Some see it as a pro-market reform. Others see it as a tool for economic justice. Still others see it as preparation for a future shaped by automation. Ultimately, the origins of UBI reveal that it is less about giving money away and more about redefining the relationship between citizens, work, and the state. It challenges the assumption that survival must always be tied to employment. It raises deep questions about fairness, productivity, and the distribution of wealth in modern economies. And as technology continues to reshape the workforce, the debate that began centuries ago is becoming increasingly urgent. Universal basic income is conceptually simple but economically complex. At its most basic level, UBI is a regular cash payment given to individuals without conditions. It is not tied to employment status, income level, or personal circumstances. Every eligible person receives the same amount on a recurring basis, typically monthly. The defining features of UBI are universality, unconditionality, regularity, and individual distribution. Universality means that everyone within a defined population receives the payment. This eliminates administrative costs associated with determining eligibility. Unconditionality means recipients are free to spend the money however they choose. Regularity ensures that payments are predictable and ongoing, allowing recipients to plan financially. Individual distribution ensures that payments go directly to people rather than households, preserving autonomy and financial independence. Funding a UBI program is the most debated component. There are multiple proposed models. One approach involves restructuring existing welfare programs, consolidating them into a single cash payment. Another approach proposes new taxes, such as higher income taxes on top earners, wealth taxes, value-added taxes, carbon taxes, or financial transaction taxes. Some proposals focus on capturing the economic gains from automation or data usage, arguing that technology-driven productivity should benefit society broadly rather than concentrating wealth among corporations. The scale of cost depends on the size of the payment and the population covered. For example, providing $10,000 per year to every adult in a country with 200 million adults would require $2 trillion annually before accounting for offsets. However, many economists note that gross cost differs from net cost. If UBI replaces certain existing benefits and increases taxable income through economic stimulation, the net cost may be lower than the headline figure suggests. Distribution mechanisms in modern economies would likely rely on digital payment systems, direct deposits, or government-managed financial platforms. Advances in financial technology make regular distribution more efficient than in past decades. Administrative overhead would likely be lower than traditional welfare programs due to the absence of means testing. One common misconception is that UBI is intended to eliminate work. Most serious proposals position it as a financial floor, not a replacement for employment income. The payment level is typically designed to cover basic living expenses partially, not to provide luxury. Supporters argue that this floor reduces extreme poverty, provides stability during job transitions, and empowers individuals to pursue education, caregiving, entrepreneurship, or creative work without the constant threat of destitution. Critics often focus on labor market effects. Would people stop working if they received guaranteed income? Evidence from pilot programs suggests modest reductions in work hours, primarily among new parents, students, and caregivers. Rather than mass withdrawal from the workforce, studies often show improved job matching, where recipients take time to find better employment rather than accepting the first available job under financial pressure. Inflation is another major concern. Opponents argue that injecting large sums of cash into the economy could drive up prices, particularly in housing and essential goods. Economists debate this point. Some argue that inflation would depend on supply constraints and overall economic capacity. If production can scale to meet increased demand, price effects may be limited. If supply is fixed, such as housing in tight urban markets, price increases could occur. UBI also interacts with taxation systems. Many proposals include clawback mechanisms through progressive taxes, meaning higher-income individuals effectively pay back more than they receive. In such systems, universality simplifies administration while the tax code ensures redistribution. There are alternative models closely related to UBI. A negative income tax provides income support only when earnings fall below a certain threshold. A partial basic income provides smaller payments supplemented by existing programs. A universal dividend, such as Alaska's Permanent Fund, distributes revenue from natural resources to residents annually. The mechanics of UBI ultimately revolve around balancing simplicity with sustainability. Policymakers must determine payment size, funding source, eligibility scope, and integration with existing systems. The economic modeling is complex, but the structural idea remains straightforward: guarantee every person a financial baseline, regardless of circumstance. As economies evolve, especially under the influence of automation and AI, the operational details of UBI become increasingly central. The question is not just whether it is desirable, but whether it is financially and politically feasible at scale. Universal basic income sits at the intersection of labor economics, technological change, and social policy. Its potential economic impact extends far beyond individual recipients. It could reshape labor markets, entrepreneurship, wage structures, and even bargaining power between workers and employers. Modern labor markets are undergoing significant transformation. Automation increasingly replaces routine manual and cognitive tasks. Artificial intelligence performs functions once considered uniquely human, including data analysis, content generation, and even aspects of medical diagnostics. As technology advances, some jobs disappear while others emerge. However, transitions can be disruptive, and not all workers benefit equally. UBI is often proposed as a buffer against this disruption. By guaranteeing a minimum income floor, individuals may feel more secure transitioning between industries, retraining, or pursuing education. Rather than clinging to declining sectors out of necessity, workers might seek opportunities aligned with emerging technologies. From a macroeconomic perspective, guaranteed income could stimulate demand. Lower-income households tend to spend a higher proportion of additional income compared to wealthier households. Increased consumer spending can drive business growth, potentially offsetting some program costs through higher tax revenues. This demand-side effect is one reason some economists view UBI as a stabilizing force during economic downturns. Entrepreneurship is another frequently cited benefit. Starting a business involves financial risk. A guaranteed income floor may reduce that risk, encouraging innovation and small business creation. Some pilot programs have reported increases in entrepreneurial activity among recipients. Work incentives remain a central debate. Traditional welfare systems sometimes create benefit cliffs, where earning slightly more income results in losing benefits entirely. UBI eliminates this cliff because payments do not decrease as income rises. This structure can preserve incentives to work while still providing support. However, large-scale implementation could influence wage dynamics. If workers are less financially desperate, they may demand higher wages for unpleasant or dangerous jobs. Employers might respond by raising wages, automating further, or restructuring roles. In theory, this could shift bargaining power toward labor. Critics argue that sustained reductions in labor supply could reduce overall economic output. Supporters counter that modern economies increasingly struggle with underemployment and job quality rather than labor shortages. Additionally, unpaid labor such as caregiving and community work may increase under UBI, contributing social value not captured by GDP metrics. Another economic dimension involves inequality. Wealth concentration has accelerated in many advanced economies. UBI could function as a redistributive mechanism, particularly if funded through progressive taxation or resource dividends. However, if funded regressively, it could have limited impact on inequality. Long-term fiscal sustainability is perhaps the most significant economic challenge. Governments would need stable revenue sources capable of supporting recurring payments through economic cycles. Debt financing at large scale would be controversial and potentially destabilizing. Ultimately, the economic implications of UBI depend heavily on design, funding, and broader policy context. It is not a standalone solution to structural inequality or technological displacement. But as automation continues to reshape employment landscapes, UBI remains one of the most widely debated proposals for maintaining economic stability in an uncertain future. One of the most debated and misunderstood aspects of universal basic income is how it would be funded. The question of cost dominates public discussion, often overshadowing deeper conversations about economic structure, taxation philosophy, and long-term fiscal sustainability. To seriously evaluate UBI, funding cannot be treated as a vague afterthought. It must be examined in the context of national budgets, tax systems, monetary policy, and economic behavior. At its core, funding UBI is not about whether a country has enough money in a literal sense. Modern governments, especially those that issue their own sovereign currency like the United States, do not operate like households. They do not need to save up dollars before spending. Instead, they manage taxation, borrowing, and monetary policy to balance economic growth and inflation. The real constraint is not simply revenue. It is inflation, productivity, and economic capacity. One proposed funding method is restructuring existing welfare programs. Many UBI models suggest consolidating multiple targeted assistance programs into a single universal payment. This could reduce administrative costs, eliminate overlapping bureaucracies, and simplify distribution. Current welfare systems often require complex eligibility checks, income verification, case management, and enforcement mechanisms. These systems are expensive to maintain. A universal system removes most of that administrative overhead because everyone receives the same amount, regardless of income. However, replacing welfare entirely is controversial. Some programs serve specific needs that a flat cash payment might not adequately cover, such as disability support or medical assistance. In practice, many serious UBI proposals do not eliminate all social programs, but rather replace certain income-based supports while preserving healthcare, disability, or housing assistance where necessary. Another major funding proposal involves tax reform. Progressive taxation is often central to UBI financing plans. Higher marginal tax rates on high earners, wealth taxes on large asset holdings, capital gains reforms, and corporate tax restructuring are commonly suggested. Under this model, UBI effectively redistributes income from higher earners back to the general population. For wealthy individuals, increased taxes may offset or exceed the UBI payment they receive, making the net benefit concentrated among lower and middle-income households. A value-added tax, VAT, is another frequently discussed funding mechanism. A VAT is a consumption tax applied at each stage of production. Because it is broad-based, it can generate substantial revenue. Some UBI advocates argue that a modest VAT could fund a significant portion of the program. Critics, however, point out that consumption taxes can be regressive, meaning lower-income households spend a higher percentage of their income on taxed goods. To counterbalance this effect, the UBI payment itself would need to exceed the additional consumption costs imposed by the VAT. There are also proposals to tax automation and artificial intelligence. As automation replaces human labor in certain industries, governments collect less payroll tax revenue. Some economists suggest imposing taxes on companies that significantly automate their workforce. The logic is that if machines replace workers, a portion of the productivity gains should support displaced individuals. However, defining and measuring automation in a legally enforceable way presents practical challenges. Carbon taxes are another potential funding source. By taxing emissions, governments can generate revenue while incentivizing cleaner energy. Revenue from carbon pricing could be distributed as a carbon dividend, functioning similarly to a partial UBI. In fact, Some existing climate proposals already operate on this principle. Tax pollution and return the proceeds directly to citizens. Wealth taxes represent one of the more controversial options. A wealth tax targets net worth rather than income. This approach aims to address long-term wealth concentration by taxing large fortunes annually. While wealth taxes could generate revenue, critics argue they may encourage capital flight, reduce investment incentives, or face constitutional challenges depending on the country. Government deficit spending is another avenue. Some economists, particularly those aligned with modern monetary theory, MMT, argue that sovereign currency issuers can fund programs like UBI through controlled deficit spending as long as inflation remains manageable. Under this framework, taxes are used not primarily to pay for spending, but to regulate demand and stabilize currency value. The main risk in this approach is inflation. If UBI increases consumer demand beyond the productive capacity of the economy, prices could rise significantly. Inflation concerns are central to the funding debate. A nationwide UBI would inject substantial purchasing power into the economy. If production of goods and services scales with increased demand, inflation may remain modest. If supply cannot keep pace, prices may rise. This is especially relevant in sectors with constrained supply, such as housing or healthcare. The net cost of UBI is also frequently misunderstood. The gross cost is the total amount paid to every citizen. But the net cost accounts for taxes paid back by higher earners and savings from reduced welfare administration. For example, if every adult receives $12,000 per year, the gross figure may appear enormous. However, after accounting for increased tax revenue and eliminated program costs, the net fiscal burden could be substantially lower. Another important factor is economic growth. Supporters argue that UBI could stimulate local economies by increasing consumer spending, especially in lower-income communities where money is more likely to be spent immediately rather than saved. This multiplier effect could partially offset costs through higher tax revenue generated from increased business activity. Opponents worry about labor supply effects. If a large number of people reduce work hours, income tax revenue could decline, increasing fiscal strain. However, evidence from smaller-scale trials suggests modest labor reduction rather than widespread workforce exit. In many cases, people use financial security to pursue education, caregiving, or entrepreneurship. The political feasibility of funding UBI may ultimately be more challenging than the economic feasibility. Major tax reforms require legislative approval, and large-scale redistribution often faces ideological resistance. Public perception plays a critical role. If UBI is framed as a replacement for inefficient bureaucracy and as a stabilizing economic tool, it may gain broader support. If framed purely as wealth redistribution, it may face stronger opposition. International comparisons also matter. Smaller countries with homogeneous populations and strong social trust may find it easier to implement UBI-like systems than large, politically polarized nations. Funding structures would likely vary significantly between countries depending on tax systems, economic size, and public spending priorities. Ultimately, the funding question forces societies to confront deeper issues. What is the purpose of taxation? How should wealth be distributed in an automated economy? What level of economic security should be guaranteed as a right of citizenship? UBI funding is not just an accounting exercise. It is a reflection of national values, economic philosophy, and long-term strategy. In practical terms, most serious proposals combine multiple funding sources rather than relying on a single mechanism. A blend of tax reform, program consolidation, moderate deficit spending, and targeted revenue sources would likely be necessary. The debate continues not because funding is impossible, but because it requires structural changes to existing fiscal systems. Understanding how UBI would be paid for means understanding the broader architecture of modern economies. It requires separating political rhetoric from economic mechanics and recognizing that the feasibility of UBI depends less on mathematical impossibility and more on collective policy choices. Universal basic income is often discussed in theory, but over the past several decades, multiple real-world trials have attempted to test how unconditional cash payments actually affect people and economies. While none of these experiments perfectly replicate a full national UBI system, They provide valuable insight into human behavior, labor participation, mental health, and economic stability. One of the most frequently cited modern experiments took place in Finland between 2017 and 2018. The Finnish government selected 2,000 unemployed individuals and provided them with a fixed monthly payment, no strings attached. Participants continued receiving the payment even if they found work. The goal was to test whether removing bureaucratic welfare conditions would improve employment outcomes and well-being. The results were complex. Employment effects were modest, with no dramatic increase or collapse in job-seeking behavior. However, participants reported significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, reduced stress, improved mental health, and greater trust in institutions. The psychological impact was more pronounced than the labor impact. In Canada, a 1970s experiment known as Mincome in the town of Dauphin, Manitoba, provided a guaranteed minimum income to residents. Although the program was eventually discontinued for political reasons, later analysis of archived data revealed meaningful outcomes. Hospitalization rates declined, particularly for mental health issues and accidents. High school completion rates increased. Workforce participation dropped slightly, but mostly among new mothers and teenagers who stayed in school longer. Rather than triggering widespread idleness, the program appeared to allow people to invest more time in education and caregiving. In the United States, several experiments in the 1960s and 1970s tested forms of negative income tax, which functions similarly to UBI by guaranteeing a minimum income floor. These trials showed small reductions in working hours, typically concentrated among secondary earners and households rather than primary wage earners. Importantly, the reduction was not a mass exit from the labor force, but a modest decrease in hours worked. More recently, in Kenya, the nonprofit organization Give Directly has conducted one of the largest and longest-running basic income studies. Villages received direct cash transfers over extended periods. Early findings indicate improvements in food security, business investment, psychological well-being, and community stability. Critics argue that small rural villages differ significantly from large industrial economies, but the data continues to challenge the assumption that unconditional cash leads to irresponsible spending. In the United States, smaller city-level pilot programs have emerged in places like Stockton, California. Participants receiving guaranteed monthly payments showed improved financial stability and were more likely to find full-time employment compared to control groups. Contrary to popular fears, the additional income did not significantly reduce work effort. Instead, it allowed recipients to manage unpredictable expenses such as car repairs, medical bills, or childcare, which in turn supported employment stability. One important pattern across nearly all experiments is the improvement in mental health. Financial insecurity creates chronic stress, which affects cognitive function, decision-making, and physical health. When people are freed from the constant anxiety of meeting basic needs, they tend to make more stable and long-term choices. This effect is difficult to quantify in purely economic terms, but appears consistently in survey data. Another recurring finding is the limited impact on inflation in small-scale trials. Because experiments are geographically limited and modest in scale, they do not significantly disrupt national price levels. However, critics argue that small pilots cannot fully simulate the inflationary pressures that might occur in a nationwide rollout. This remains one of the largest unknowns in UBI research. A key limitation of most experiments is duration. Many trials last 1 to 3 years. Long-term behavioral shifts, generational impacts, and macroeconomic adjustments may take decades to fully observe. Additionally, knowing that a program is temporary may influence participant behavior differently than a permanent policy would. There is also the issue of scale. Providing income to a few thousand individuals does not carry the same fiscal implications as distributing payments to millions. National implementation would require tax reforms, budget restructuring, and potentially new monetary strategies. Pilot programs cannot fully replicate these macroeconomic dynamics. Cultural context matters as well. Social norms surrounding work vary across countries. In some societies, employment is deeply tied to identity and social contribution. In others, informal economies and family networks already play a large role. Results in one nation cannot automatically be applied to another without considering these cultural differences. Despite these limitations, the consistent theme across most trials is stability rather than collapse. Work does not disappear. Communities do not disintegrate. Spending patterns do not become reckless. Instead, people tend to use unconditional cash to smooth volatility in their lives. They pay off debt, invest in small businesses, improve housing conditions, pursue education, and reduce stress-related health issues. Another important lesson from real-world experiments is administrative simplicity. Delivering unconditional payments is often cheaper and more efficient than managing complex eligibility-based systems. Reduced bureaucracy not only saves money but also minimizes stigma and exclusion errors, where eligible individuals fail to receive benefits due to paperwork barriers. The political reaction to these trials has varied widely. Supporters point to measurable improvements in well-being and modest labor impact as evidence that UBI is viable. Opponents argue that limited experiments cannot capture long-term fiscal strain or nationwide economic shifts. Both perspectives acknowledge that more large-scale data would be valuable. Ultimately, real-world experiments have shifted the debate from abstract speculation to evidence-based discussion. They do not prove that UBI is universally perfect or economically risk-free. However, they consistently challenge the narrative that unconditional income inevitably destroys work ethic or economic productivity. These trials suggest that when people are given financial security, most do not withdraw from society. Instead, they gain the breathing room necessary to participate more effectively. The lessons learned so far indicate that the question is no longer whether unconditional cash causes immediate social breakdown. The more pressing question is how such a system could be responsibly scaled, funded, and integrated into national economies over the long term. As debates around universal basic income continue to evolve, the conversation is no longer confined to academic theory or small-scale experiments. It now intersects with some of the largest economic transformations in modern history: automation, artificial intelligence, demographic shifts, rising inequality, and changing definitions of work itself. Whether UBI becomes a permanent feature of national economies or remains a policy experiment will depend on how societies respond to these pressures in the coming decades. One of the primary forces driving renewed interest in UBI is technological disruption. Advances in artificial intelligence, robotics, and machine learning are reshaping labor markets across industries. Manufacturing, logistics, transportation, and even white-collar professions are increasingly affected by automation. While technology has historically created new jobs alongside those it replaces, the speed and scale of current developments raise questions about whether job creation will keep pace with job displacement. In the United States, policymakers and public figures have debated how to respond to these shifts. During the 2020 presidential election, entrepreneur Andrew Yang popularized the idea of a freedom dividend, proposing a $1,000 per month payment to every adult citizen. His campaign brought UBI into mainstream political discussion, reframing it not as a fringe concept, but as a potential response to automation and economic instability. Beyond automation, demographic trends are also shaping the debate. Many developed nations face aging populations and declining birth rates. In countries like Japan and Germany, shrinking workforces must support growing numbers of retirees. A universal income system could theoretically simplify pension systems or provide flexible support structures, though it would also require substantial funding. Another driving force is income inequality. Over the past several decades, wealth concentration has increased in many advanced economies. Critics of the current system argue that productivity gains have disproportionately benefited capital owners rather than wage earners. UBI is sometimes presented as a mechanism to redistribute a portion of economic growth more evenly across society. However, the future of UBI hinges on funding mechanisms. A national program would require massive fiscal resources. Proposals include value-added taxes, wealth taxes, carbon taxes, financial transaction taxes, or reallocating existing welfare budgets. Each option carries trade-offs. Higher taxes may affect investment and growth. Reallocating welfare funds could leave vulnerable populations with fewer targeted services. Printing money risks inflation if not carefully managed. Inflation remains one of the most debated risks. If everyone receives additional income simultaneously, demand for goods and services could rise faster than supply, potentially increasing prices. Some economists argue that careful tax-based funding would neutralize inflationary pressures, since money would be redistributed rather than newly created. Others warn that housing markets, healthcare, and education could experience upward price pressure without supply-side reforms. There is also the question of political sustainability. Once implemented, universal programs tend to gain strong public support because everyone benefits. Programs like Social Security in the United States or national healthcare systems in various countries demonstrate that universal structures can become deeply embedded in political culture. However, initial implementation often faces fierce opposition due to cost concerns and ideological disagreements. Another possible future path for UBI is partial or hybrid models. Instead of a full universal income, governments might implement targeted basic income for specific age groups, such as children or seniors. Some countries have experimented with child allowances that resemble a limited UBI. Others have expanded tax credits that function similarly to guaranteed income for low-income workers. Digital currency systems may also influence how UBI is administered. Central bank digital currencies could theoretically allow governments to distribute payments efficiently and transparently. However, such systems raise privacy concerns and fears of financial surveillance. The technological infrastructure behind distribution will shape public trust in any future system. Cultural attitudes toward work will also play a defining role. In many societies, employment is more than a source of income. It provides identity, structure, and social connection. Critics argue that a guaranteed income could weaken the social fabric tied to work. Supporters counter that UBI could free individuals to pursue education, caregiving, entrepreneurship, creative endeavors, or community service without the constant pressure of survival. One emerging perspective reframes UBI not as a replacement for work, but as a foundation for economic flexibility. In volatile economies characterized by gig work, contract labor, and unpredictable hours, a guaranteed income floor could stabilize household finances. Rather than eliminating work incentives, it might reduce desperation-driven employment and allow people to seek better matches for their skills. Global crises have further intensified the discussion. During economic shutdowns and emergencies, governments around the world issued direct cash payments to citizens. In the United States, stimulus checks demonstrated that large-scale cash distribution is administratively possible. These temporary measures resembled short-term basic income and offered a glimpse into how rapid financial relief can stabilize economies during crisis. Still, UBI is not a guaranteed outcome of these trends. Alternative policy approaches compete for attention, including expanded job guarantees, targeted welfare reform, universal healthcare, free education, and housing subsidies. Some economists argue that direct job creation programs may better preserve the social value of work while addressing unemployment. The future of UBI will likely be shaped by incremental change rather than sudden transformation. More pilot programs, expanded child benefits, tax credit reforms, and automation-related policy debates will gradually influence public opinion. Economic shocks may accelerate adoption, while stable growth periods may reduce urgency. As this debate continues, one core question remains at the center. What is the purpose of an economy? If the primary goal is maximizing productivity, then UBI must be evaluated through growth metrics and labor participation data. If the goal includes stability, well-being, and human dignity, then broader measures of success become relevant. Universal basic income challenges traditional assumptions about work, value, and security. It forces societies to reconsider whether survival should be tied entirely to labor market participation. It also raises difficult trade-offs about taxation, incentives, and fiscal responsibility. The future remains uncertain. UBI could become a defining policy of the 21st century, a temporary experiment in economic transition, or a stepping stone toward entirely different models of social support. What is clear is that the conversation will not disappear. As technology advances and economies evolve, the pressure to rethink income security will continue to grow. This concludes our deep exploration of universal basic income. From its philosophical origins to modern experiments, economic debates, and the possibilities ahead. Whether you support it or oppose it, UBI represents one of the most transformative policy ideas of our time, and its future will depend on the choices societies make in response to rapid economic change. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.